Hello y bienvenido a Respuestas Inglesas, un podcast que te da unas llavitas claves mientras abres las puertas de tu aventura en inglés. Soy la presentadora Sarah con Language Answers y hoy vamos a discutir las diferencias ortográficas entre el inglés americano, canadiense y británico en inglés. Entonces, el episodio de hoy será en inglés, ya que no me siento bien esta semana y no estoy seguro de poder traducirlo también. Por favor, disculpa por cualquier inconveniente y agradezco su comprensión. Did you know that English spelling, that crazy jumble of illogical rules on top of 1,000 exceptions, is even more discombobulated than you thought? That's because how you spell many words also depends on where you are. Are you trying to reach an American audience? Then you need to follow American English. Are you hoping to attract the attention of the British? Then you need to use British English. These are the two main variants when it comes to English orthography. But there is a middle variant, Canadian English, a happy hybrid of the two. But never fear, today's episode will explain why these differences exist and will break down the main spelling differences for your ease and understanding. And then we will begin our new cultural tip on the country of Lesotho. So, let's get started. Empecemos! La historia. Basically, English during the 11th century was at a particularly low point due to the Norman conquest of England in 1066 AD. At this time, French became the court language, and so the French scribes would write English words based on, what else? French spelling rules. Outside of this, English had no standard, so across the English-speaking world, spelling was different depending on local preferences. Take into consideration the great vowel shift between the 14th and 18th centuries, in which how English was pronounced shifted, albeit spelling didn't, hence why many words we use today don't actually look the way they sound. And the orthographical confusion gets even worse. Now, we talked about the great vowel shift, or el gran cambio de vocales, a while ago in Episodio 35, los 10 sonidos de O, U, G, H. Then, in 1755, the British got a huge help in standardizing their language from Samuel Johnson, who published a dictionary of the English language. It took him 8 years and 6 helpers to put together this 40,000 word book, where they used the most common spellings rather than the most logical. This book was soon the main spelling reference for England. Fast forward to 1806, 23 years after the end of the American Revolution, and we have Noah Webster printing a compendious dictionary of the English language. This book focused on the American spellings of words and had about 5,000 more words than Johnson's dictionary, and it separated U and V, as well as I and J. At the age of 70, Webster printed his An American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828. This 2-volume book had around 70,000 words, with 30,000 to 40,000 new definitions never printed in a dictionary at this point. Webster is one of the key reasons why we have American versus British spellings. His dictionaries fit in well with the patriotic feelings at the time of America creating her own identity separate from that of Britain. Webster also wanted to reform and simplify English spelling, basing a word's spelling on how it was spoken versus how it was traditionally written. Some of these changes stuck, such as changing the ending YSE in words like analyze to YZE or to IZE, and dropping the U from words like color, COLOUR, so it would just be COLOR. Unfortunately, others, like his attempts to spell woman as WIMMEN, and daughter as DAWTER, were ridiculed and ignored. So while Webster died believing he was a failed lexicographer, his dictionaries did not sell so well, his publishers Charles and George Merriam bought the rights from his estate and continued modifying the dictionary, ultimately triumphing and creating the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which is currently seen as the official reference for American English spelling and usage. Unless, of course, you play Scrabble, then it's the Scrabble Dictionary. But I digress. So where does Canada come in on all of this? Well, in 1890, the first Canadian Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, maintained that British spelling should be the standard in Canada. Despite this, America has had a huge influence on Canada, thus eroding the dedication to mainly British English and creating a unique hybrid of both. Las diferencias claves. The following outlines the key differences between American and British English with notes on which usage Canada follows. And I do recommend that you check out the blog where I will have all of this in a table format because that will make it easier to read and it'll make it easier to see the spelling differences. But I will try and be as clear and succinct as possible in the podcast format. So our first spelling rule is the suffixes or endings of OUR versus OR. For many words, Americans drop the U. So instead of writing color, COLOUR, like the British do, we would just write color, COLOR. Or instead of writing labor, LABOUR, we would write labor, LABOR. A little bit simpler. Now, there are some exceptions where American and British English either both keep the U or drop it, such as in actor, alligator, and vendor, where they drop the U, or in detour and glamour, where we keep the U. British English will also drop the U for some words when you add specific suffixes or endings, such as OUS. For example, they spell humor, HUMOUR, but if you were to add OUS instead and make it humorous, then it would be HUMOROUS, so that U is dropped. Same thing happens in labor and laborious. Now, if you want to do a deeper dive on that, check out the free dictionary's really in-depth article. I will, of course, include a link in the show notes, but it's fantastic. Now, when it comes to Canadians, they follow the British way with this spelling rule. So they will always have, not always, but most of the time, they will have OUR at the end. Now, the next spelling rule regards the endings ENCE versus ENSE. So do you end it with a C or do you end it with an S? There are only 4 words that have this difference, and that is defense, license, offense, and pretense. So in the American spelling, you will have defense spelled as DEFENSE. But in the British spelling, you will have it as DEFENCE. And the same goes for license, offense, and pretense. But please note that in British and Canadian spellings, they actually differentiate between the noun and verb form of license and practice via spellings. So if you use the CE ending, you are referring to a noun, but the SE ending is for verbs. So for example, I would say, I have practice at 7, PRACTICE. But I practice, PRACTISE, the piano every day. Or I have my license with a C in my wallet, but the government has licensed them to sell liquor, licensed with an S. The next rule of spelling is the ending RE versus ER. The American spelling is ER, and the British spelling is RE. So, for example, if you have center, it's going to be CENTER in American English, but CENTRE in British English. The same would happen with fiber and somber, right? In American English, somber is SOMBER, but in British English, it's SOMBRE. Now, there are exceptions to the British spelling, as many words also end in ER, like finger, golfer, and water, WATER. Just a quick explanation of the RE ending, it's a remnant of past French spellings for these words. So there are also words in both English variants that always end in RE. Generally when it follows a hard C sound, such as euchre, massacre, but there's also ogre, right? So euchre is EUCHRE and ogre is OGRE. But this is also true of foreign loan words like genre and macabre. Now, Canada tends to follow the British way for scientific writing, although some areas accept the American way of ER as well. Now, the next rule of thumb is the ending ISE versus IZE. The British spelling uses the ISE ending. So for example, with the word localize, in British spelling, it's Localise, but in American spelling, it's Localize. And the same goes for words like organize, apologize, or baptize. In American English, it will have a Z at the end, a ZE, but in British English, it'll have an SE instead. Now, there are some verbs in both American and British English that use the IZE ending, such as capsize, size, or seize. On the flip side, there are several words, most of them existing French verbs, that use ISE, even in the American usage, like advertise, despise, disguise, exercise, surprise, and revise. Now, Canada uses the American usage here, so they would end in the IZE format instead of SE. This next suffix follows the same rule as the ISE and IZE ending. It's the LYSE versus the LYZE ending. So words like analyze, catalyze, hydrolyze, electrolyze, and paralyze. In American spelling, they have a ZE at the end, but in British spelling, they have an SE at the end. So that makes it really easy, right? It's the same as the ISE and the IZE endings. And also, same or similar here is that Canada uses the American usage as well. So in Canada, you would use a ZE ending instead of SE. All right, let's talk about the next one, which is doubling the L or not. So have you ever wondered how to tell if a word should have two L's or just one when you add a suffix to it? For example, is it traveled with one L or is it traveled with two L's? Because travel only has one, but English has this annoying habit of sometimes adding a second L to the word when you're adding like ED or ING to it. So a good rule of thumb in American English is to add an extra L if the basic word is stressed on the last syllable. So compel, where the stress is on that last syllable, compel becomes compelled with two L's. And rebel with one L, right, becomes rebelling with two L's. But then you have travel, where the stress is on the first syllable, travel. It becomes traveled with one L. And signal is the same way. It becomes signaling with one L. But in British English, you almost always add a second L because it doubles whenever there's a vowel before the L. So travel would be traveled with two L's, and signal would be signaling with two L's, even though the stress is on the first syllable. Doesn't matter in British English. Now, there are a few verbs in American English that have two L's. No. So other words that would fall under this are barreling, canceled, fueling, rivaled, traveling, and signaled. In American English, they're all going to have just one L. But in British English, they're all going to have two. Now, there are a few verbs in American English that have two L's, where the British English doesn't, such as appall and instill, or enroll and fulfill. But both English variants spell skill and will with two L's, right? SKILL and WILL. But when you add the suffix FUL to them, full, then only in British English do you lose an L. So it would be willful and skillful, but in American English it has two L's, and in British English it has one. Which really, as an American, looking at willful and skillful without those two L's, it looks really weird. I wonder if it must be the same for a British speaker. Anyways, Canada generally uses the British usage here, but when writing to a Canadian audience, I would still check with the regional rules just to be sure. All right, if I haven't lost you yet, let's keep going. The next is to use just an E or to use AE or OE. Now, this all has to do with Latin-based words in English. So with these words, the ligatures, or special characters that denote a diphthong sound, we've got A and E, it looks like an A and an E squished together, and an O and an E squished together. But in English, they have now become two separate letters, A and E and O and E. Now, British English still has these, but American English has only kept the E. So words like pediatric and esophagus in British English would be spelled Paediatric and Oesophagus. But in American English, we lose one of those A's and one of those O's, and it's just Pediatric and Esophagus. So when I'm looking at the words, in American English, I would say pediatric and esophagus. But if I didn't know that that's what I was trying to say in British English, I would call it pediatric and esophagus. Like I said, as an American, those words look super weird to me. Now, there are other words, right, where this is also true. So anesthesia, right? The second or the first E in there would normally have an A before it in British English. And in encyclopedia, the second E also has that A before it, but only in British English. Eon, same thing. In British English, it starts with an A. In American English, it starts with an E. Who knew? Then there's words like hemoglobin, hemophilia, hemorrhage, leukemia, orthopedic, paleontology, apnea, celiac, esophagus, estrogen, fetus, and maneuver. All of these in American English do not have the special diphthongs, just the E, whereas in British English, they will. So like celiac looks super weird in British English. It has a Coeliac. I have no idea how you're supposed to know that that makes this sound because it's CO. Normally CO does not make us sound in English. Anyways, moving on. There are a few words that maintain the diphthongs in both English variants, such as amoeba, Amoeba, and phoenix, Phoenix, archaeology, and aesthetic. There are also words in both that use just the E, like in chimera, Chimera, or demon, Demon, fetid, Fetid, and enigma and medieval. And in so all of these words used to have, or should have because of their Latin spelling, these diphthongs, either an AE or an OE, but in both American and British English, they have lost them and only have the E. Now, in both English variants, direct Latin words are pluralized with AE, such as algae, which I only just now learned the singular form is alga. Who knew? But anyways, the plural, you add an AE, it's algae. And amoeba, right, plural, you add that AE at the end instead of just E, and it's amoebae. And placenta would be placenti. Really weird. I think you can also do placentas in American English, but which sounds a little bit better just to my ears. But anyways, Canada tends to use the British spelling, but it can also depend on the context. The quote-unquote lay press uses the American spelling, whereas medical and scientific writings will use the British method. And this can be true in America as well. All right, moving on to the OG versus OGUE ending. There are only 4 words where American and British English differ on this, with the British English using the longer OGUE ending. So for analog, right, in American spelling, it would just be ANALOG. Really simple. But in British spelling, it would be ANALOGUE. They just add those 2 words after, or 2 letters after that. And the other 3 words that this works with is catalog, dialogue, and homologue. Now, while some resources claim that this is generally the case, that American English uses OG and British English uses OGUE, that's really not quite true. Technically, either spelling would be correct for words like monologue or epilogue in American English, but to leave out the UE at the end looks really weird to me. So I would actually argue, no, they're not correct, no matter what Merriam-Webster says. But most such words in American English still end in OGUE, like rogue, synagogue, or prologue. Why we differ on those 4 specific words, I have no idea. But no surprise, Canada follows the British usage here. And lastly, if I still haven't lost you, well done, you've held on to the end. Random words. There are also words that, for one reason or another, are spelled differently in American English versus British English, and Canadian English will sometimes follow one and sometimes the other. So if you find yourself needing to write to different audiences, I did in my previous job, I recommend keeping a growing list of these words that you can reference whenever you need. So some examples would be check. In American English, it's CHECK, but in British English, it's CHEQUE. Aluminum is how you say it in American English, but there's an extra I in British English, so it's aluminium. Aging in British English has an extra E in the word right after G, which, I mean, kind of makes sense, right? To make the G a J sound, although I really does do the trick. But anyways, that's way too technical than what we need here. So aging in American English has no E, British English it does. Gray is spelled with an A in American English, so A for American, if you need to remember, because I definitely need help remembering that when I write, and E in British English, Grey. Tire in American English is with an I, but in British English, it's with a Y. Curb is CURB in America, but in Britain, it's KERB. How you refer to your mom, in America, it's mom, MOM, but in Britain, it's mum, MUM. And lastly, another example is program. In British English, they add an extra ME to it. So it's PROGRAMME. A little bit longer. Anyways, this wraps it up. This is not a definitive list. So always check the spelling if you're not sure. Or better yet, have an editor from the region you want to use double check it for you. Lastly, but certainly not least, los diccionarios autorizados por país. Here are some good dictionaries you can use as references as well. For American English, there is, of course, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary, and the New Oxford American Dictionary. Now, I included links to Merriam-Webster and American Heritage Dictionary, but I don't think the New Oxford American Dictionary has a free online use. For British English, there is, of course, the Oxford English Dictionary, also known as the OED, and the Cambridge Dictionary, which also has, in the link I'm going to include, has learner dictionaries for non-English native speakers and Spanish to English dictionaries. So really helpful. I've included links for both of those dictionaries, but for Canadian English, unfortunately, I could not find any free online versions of these dictionaries, but I'll give you the list anyway. There's the Canadian Oxford Dictionary, the Gage Canadian Dictionary, and the Collins Canadian Dictionary. Now, I also found a comparison database online where you can type in a word and it'll show you the spellings for all three English variants. But be careful because the link is not a secure HTTPS. It's just HTTP. But it's pretty cool. I wouldn't use it as your go-to for everything top reference, but for just general help, it's awesome. And that pretty much wraps up our entire episode on the differences between the three main English spelling variants. All right, so this episode has already gone way longer than I intended, so we will try and do a quick cultural tip. And of course, it's our first cultural tip on the country of Lesotho, or its official name is the Kingdom of Lesotho. According to the World Factbook, Lesotho is just a little smaller than the state of Maryland, and it is located in South Africa. I mean, this country is completely landlocked / surrounded by South Africa on the southern tip of the African continent. As for its government, it is a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. This means that the chief of state is King Letsie III, as of 1996, while the head of government is the Prime Minister Mokgweetsi Maduro, as of May 2020. While the monarchy was hereditary, in 1993, the new constitution stated that the monarch has no executive or legislative powers. The College of Chiefs can depose a monarch or choose who will be the next monarch or regent. The Prime Minister is the leader of the majority party / coalition of the National Assembly. The bicameral parliament is really interesting. It has a Senate composed of 33 seats with 22 principal chiefs and 11 senators nominated by the king, although he is advised by the 13-member group, the Council of State, for those 11. Now, there is also the National Assembly, which has 120 seats, with 40 elected via proportional representation and 80 via single-seat constituencies with majority vote. For all of Parliament, members are elected for 5-year terms. The judicial branch is composed of the Court of Appeal, which has a court president, the Chief Justice, and other judges, including puisne judges? Not really sure how to say that. Puisne. The court president is appointed by the monarch, although he is advised by the prime minister, whereas he appoints the puisne judges, but is advised by the Judicial Service Commission. And other part of the judicial branch is the High Court, which also has a Chief Justice and puisne judges. Now, judges can serve until they are 75. The capital city of Lesotho is Maseru, and as of 2014, Protestants made up about 48% of the country's religion, with Roman Catholicism at around 39% and other Christian at about 9%. The country has 2 official languages, Sesotho and English, although Zulu and Xhosa are also spoken. The currency is the Maloti, or LSL, and here's a quick brief history. So Chief Moshosho, again, I apologize for all the butchery I'm doing on these names, the first created Basuto land in the early 19th century, becoming king in 1822. In order to protect his territory from Dutch settlers, he entered into an agreement with the UK in 1868 to become a British protectorate. In 1884, this turned into a crown colony. The country was renamed the Kingdom of Lesotho when it gained independence in 1966, although King Moshosho II was exiled for a time in the early 1990s during the 7 years of military rule. The constitutional government was restored in 1993, and he was reinstated in 1995. He was then succeeded by his son and the current king, King Letsie III, in 1996. In 1998, there was a military mutiny and violent protests, but military forces from South Africa and Botswana intervened, and the country underwent constitutional reforms. For the most part, modern elections have been peaceful, albeit not without contention. Y eso es todo por hoy. Muchísimas gracias por escuchar y no olvides consultar las notas del podcast para los enlaces de los recursos utilizados para este episodio. Y si prefieres leer una transcripción aproximada del episodio de hoy, puedes visitar el blog de este episodio también. Si te gustó este episodio, házmelo saber y deja un comentario positivo y suscríbete para no faltar ningún episodio. Me encantaría ayudarte en tu travesía de inglés, así que si tienes alguna pregunta sobre el episodio de hoy o incluso sobre la cultura o la gramática inglesas, puedes contactarme en contact@languageanswers.com o visitar mi sitio web para obtener más información a www.languageanswers.com. También puedes ponerte en contacto conmigo en relación con mis servicios de traducción de español a inglés, redacción técnica, edición y creación de contenido en inglés o incluso consultas de idiomas y tutoría para ti o tu negocio. Recuerda, aprender un idioma es una travesía para toda la vida. Entonces, embrace it, enjoy it, and share it. Nos vemos en 2 semanas. ¡Hasta luego!